Good evening to all of you, those of you we know well and those we haven't met yet. Welcome to all of our viewers tonight. Whether this is your first time watching the Clergy Roundtable or you watch every week, whether you're a member or friend of Naples UCC or you happen to stumble across it because a friend sent it to you, we're glad you've joined us. My name is Deb Kaiser-Cross, and I serve as the Minister for Congregational Care here at Naples UCC. For another week, I'm happy to be having this thought-provoking conversation with my colleagues. Actually, they're pretty fabulous clergy colleagues. Reverend Dr. Dawson Taylor, who's a senior minister here, and Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, who is the assistant minister here. And before we get started, I want to turn it over to Dawson for any announcements.
Sure. And I think one of the things that we talked about before we went live as a team is simply to take a moment to celebrate a peaceful transition of power today, no matter your party, no matter who you voted for, after the turmoil that we've seen over the last 2 weeks. I know on behalf of this team and on behalf of our church, we celebrate a peaceful transfer of that power, and that our prayers continue for that continued peace and that continued smooth process. And, I know we've talked about it the first 2 weeks, and we will continue to, but I think this book is so apropos for the time that we're living in and living through. I'll say that. Also, just want to remind people who are members of our congregation that we are asking for proxies to be returned for the annual meeting by tomorrow, Thursday, at 4 p.m., and you can drop those by the church. There is a box outside of the office door, and you can drop those by. If you put them in the mail at this point, I think that's probably a little too late. But if you are in town, you can do that. You can also give the church office a call. If you don't have your proxy, you can swing by and fill one out. We would greatly appreciate it. The key behind that is that that helps us achieve quorum, which is required, of course, by our bylaws at 10%. And so we want to be able to do that. If you have questions about the slate of nominations, about bylaws, about budget, any of that, you can always call the church office and we will get you connected to the right person to answer any questions if you have questions before you vote. But again, the proxies are most helpful for quorum. So thank you for that time, and I look forward to our conversation tonight.
And before we get started, I also want to do a little call out to Brad and to Alex, who are doing our wonderful AV support tonight, and to Wendy, who always does our flower arrangements. Yeah. So let's get started.
All right.
This is week 3 of our roundtable discussion of The World is About to Turn. And it's by Rick Rouse and Paul Ingram. I don't have to remind you that this has been a challenging year on so many fronts. Watching the divisions in our nation and in faith communities has been discouraging for many of us. Seeing violence explode in our nation's capital a couple of weeks ago shocked all of us. And today, as we entered this new chapter in our country, I believe this book gives us a glimpse of how to chart a new path forward. The authors address the questions of underlying the political tension that's all around us and the hope for mending those divisions, beginning with people of faith. They write this book with that short scripture passage that we're going to remind you of each week from Micah 6:8. It's the touchstone of the book. The prophet said, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." So we've divided the book into 6 sessions for reading and discussion together. The first week, Sharon set the stage by helping us to consider the introductory material in the chapter 1. And then last week, Dawson led the conversation during which we focused on what it means to do justice and the challenges that we face in understanding justice and then in actually seeking it as people of faith. So this week, we're going to focus on the second part of the scripture. We're going to touch on what it means to love kindness and how to practice compassion, and how that can play out in practical ways in our world and faith communities. The authors highlight 3 ways that we can engage in loving one another. First, by acting with kindness and compassion. Second, by showing love to the stranger. And third, by practicing hospitality. According to the authors, these are the hallmarks of what it means to love kindness. So, the chapter leads with a bold statement by a Southern Baptist pastor. I may as well just get started with it. He said, preaching that we are to love our neighbor, welcome the stranger, and stand up for the marginalized does not mean you are making political statements. It means you're making biblical statements. So we can wade right into the waters of controversy right now. Most pastors I know carefully consider the statements they make that can be seen as political or partisan. And I was really struck by this pastor's perspective. What thoughts do you have on this comment?
Well, I was delighted. You didn't mention that this was a Southern Baptist
did.
pastor. Oh, you did? Okay.
Oh, I did.
And I think it's just that little reminder we always need that we can't stereotype and that we can all surprise one another. But I love the passage. I certainly agree that loving neighbor, welcoming stranger, and standing up for the marginalized is incredibly biblical. And I was trying to think about, well, if you were going to argue against that, what would you say? And it occurred to me that on the one hand, you could say, well, yes, the Bible does say that, but it's not literal. We're not supposed to literally be doing that. I don't think that'll get you very far, but that you could make that argument. I think what's probably a more realistic response for many of us is, okay, I get it. I know that's what we're supposed to do. The question is, how do we do it? And so where you start getting partisan and political is when you start talking about loving the stranger or welcoming the stranger, and you're talking about that in terms of immigration policy. How do you do that? And there's no easy answer, and the Bible doesn't offer a prescription for how to do it, but just clearly it's what we have to do.
Yeah, and I was, Deb, I was struck by the comment that you made leading into it about, pastors carefully thinking about what they say. I don't know any pastor who doesn't carefully think about weighting that, and even pastors who go beyond what their congregation wishes they would do, or wishes they wouldn't do. I think often that there is intentionality in that, and that is such a careful line that you have to be so mindful of. And I do think, and have tried to help people understand, there's such a distinction between political and partisan, because I think we so often forget how political Jesus was. And I was trying to remember, I was going to pull the article before this evening and forgot to do it. I can't remember if it was the Washington Post or the New York Times, but a couple weeks ago there was this fantastic article about the radical Jesus and about how we have forgotten in our modern era about how radical Jesus was and how radical some of the statements that he made was. Now, I'm not suggesting that every church needs to live into that radical nature. That's not, I don't necessarily believe that radical is healthy at all times, but there is a distinct difference, as Sharon pointed out so well. There's this distinct difference between advocating certain policies that might be lined up within a certain political affiliation versus advocating for the marginalized or advocating for the poor, advocating for the immigrant. And I do wonder, I find myself often thinking where it is where we have lost sight of that and where we've become so afraid of that
Right.
today.
Well, I want to just honor both of your comments because you really laid it out well. The only thing I want to add to it is what we're going to actually talk about next week, and that is to do it with humility. Because I do think it's very easy to talk about, the greater biblical narrative, which is welcoming the stranger, practicing hospitality, standing up for the marginalized. It's when we think we know exactly how to do that without regard to listening to other people's perspectives on how to do that we get in trouble. So I think if we have a measure of humility that goes with it, I'm also going to say one other thing. You can tell I'm getting closer to retirement because I just kind of say it now. I think as a younger pastor, I was a lot more hesitant to say these things. But now I just think we're at a place in this world that if people of faith don't stand up and say these things, it's a scary place to be. And so I think it's very important to have this conversation.
Right. And so, what does that say about our churches today? So this is not an indictment on this church or an indictment on your ministry. I'm asking the bigger question. What does it say about our churches today and about where the precarious place that we put clergy today, that as you get closer to retirement, people feel either more freedom or feel compelled to say those things that perhaps you don't when you're younger, or I mean, I
Well,
just
also
find
think
myself wondering.
I think it's getting older as well.
Sure.
Because I looked at my father, who tended to be pretty apolitical until he got much older, when he realized that if he didn't speak out and he didn't say what he thought needed to be said, then he would lose his opportunity. And so I think measured responses often are clergy do, because we have people on both
Sure.
sides. We want to honor the differences in the community of faith at the same time.
Yeah, and I saw the same in my dad. I mean, we
Yeah.
talked openly about that.
I want to pick up, though, Deb, at the very beginning, you talked about division even within the church and within faith traditions. And I think, to piggyback on what Dawson was saying, actually, if we can come together as Christians who agree, the Bible says, welcome the stranger, then that provides a context for saying, okay, we agree that's the goal. So let's hammer out how we do that. We may disagree. We may think different things are going to work better or not work as well. But that really can become a common ground for Christians to work together and say, the Bible's pretty clear about some of these things. So let's figure out the hows together because we have the same goal.
Absolutely.
I think that makes so much sense.
Well, I guess we'll move on. That we could go on.
I was
and
going
do
to say,
that one for an
yeah,
hour,
no
I
kidding. That
think,
could be
but-
the rest of the hour.
Okay, so let's start with basic definitions of kindness and compassion. Yes.
But before we do that,
Yes.
because before he gets to definitions, they cite a couple of wonderful stories of where communities came together across different faiths. And I just want to affirm that that was one of my first experiences after moving to Naples in 2016, and that we have our own story. So some of you who were here will remember it was in December of 2016 that there was vandalism of the sign at Temple Shalom. And I read about it, I think it was over the weekend maybe, and on Monday or Tuesday there was an article in the Naples Daily News, and I was so impressed that the faith communities had come together instantly, that there was going to be a Shabbat for solidarity
Yeah.
on Friday evening, and that same week. And I've only lived here a few months, but I'm going to be there. And if you went, I can't even say it was standing room only. We were out the door with, I don't know what they say, 1,300 people. It
Yeah,
was
and
a phenomenal attendance, and it just fed my heart so much to feel like these were Jews, Christians, Muslims, every faith tradition, and they came together and said, we will not allow this in our community. So these are wonderful stories about Seattle and other things, but I think we have our own story, and when we need hope, that gave me a lot of hope.
And I wasn't living here then, so thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And I think many people listening probably weren't here
Well,
then. So now we'll go on to definitions of kindness and compassion. Webster's dictionary describes a person who is kind as having a sympathetic or helpful nature, a forbearing nature, one who's gentle. And a compassionate person is one who has a sympathetic consciousness of others' distress with a desire to alleviate it, one who shows mercy. So if that's our starting point, let's look at these words in the faith context. So how would you define a compassionate or kind person?
I kind of think of it as happiness and joy. Like you can experience people who are happy, but it can be fleeting. And so I sometimes look and you can experience people who are kind, but it can be fleeting. I see people who are joyful the same way I see people who are compassionate. That there is there's something there that I can't always define, or you can't always necessarily see, but there is a deeper power, a deeper strength that's not fleeting, that it's just an overarching or a constant. And so for me, that was a way to define it, was up against something.
I have to play with that. That's not something that I've ever thought about. I guess I think of both of them as related, but in terms of people who are really looking out for others first, whose raison d'etre, if you will, is not their own gain and their own will and whatever they can get out of a situation, but it's about what can they do for others and treating other people with gentleness. I associate gentleness with kindness. And I guess it's just that you can feel the care coming from someone who is kind or has compassion.
You know, and I was thinking about compassion, it's when I think of compassionate people, I think of people who are very present with us in a time of need. And as if we are the only person in the room, and they are trying very deeply to enter into whatever it is I'm going through. And so if you look at the root of it is cum, which is with, and pathos, which is the sense of being with someone. And so I always think of that, and I think kindness, for me, is a little more fleeting. But compassion is a stance almost for me.
An ethos almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you see compassion and kindness lived out here at NUCC?
Wow.
Or in other faith communities that you've been a part of before?
It's a place in which I see some of the differences between a large church and a small church. That I grew up in a relatively small church, and so I would talk about the compassion and kindness. It was really like my extended family. We had no relatives in the area. My parents had moved 1,000 miles from all of their relatives. So that church really was my family, and I had all kinds of adults. At this point, many of them have passed. My parents are still alive, and they are surrogate parents for a lot of my peers who are still in the community. But I think in a large church like this, it's happening in smaller groups. So as fellowship, as caring is part of the choir or our classes or the caregiver support group, that it's about relationships. And in a larger church, you find the relationships in smaller groups within the whole. But I guess I would say it's about relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think the compassion, I think, runs so deep in who this church is. I mean, I think about, the immediate example that came to mind was when the pandemic began, I always kind of say it was really on the map last March. And the Board of Mission and Outreach, they may have been spurred on by you, Deb. I've never really asked. They were not by me. Came to us and said, we know that this is going to create a continued crisis for those who are food insecure. And so we want to give a grant with funds that are already on hand. We don't want to go raise money to the Harry Chapin Food Bank. And I just remember thinking, thank God. Because, we as a clergy team and staff were worrying about things like how do we broadcast worship and how do we stay connected to our members and how do we do we were preparing for how do we care for people with COVID and things like that. And so it was the partnership with the laity that was driving the compassion, talk about kind of the flip of that. And so, I don't know, I just think I just remember thinking how remarkable that was and how impactful that was to me as a pastor, but also as a member of this church.
And I'm blessed to be minister for congregational care, so I got to see a lot of this. It came up for me, Board of Mission is a great example, but it also came up, one of the trustees called and said, there's this person who's isolated and alone. I really think I need to just go get groceries for them. Yeah. It was an unexpected kindness. I see it with our Stephen ministers who made phone calls to anybody they could think of in the congregation that they thought could use some love during all of this, and have continued to do that. And it is part of the DNA, but it happens more in the small groups because you've got to know people to be compassionate on some level, to really be with them. You can be kind to a stranger, but to be compassionate, you kind of have to get it. And so I think it's happened in countless ways in this place. So, can you think of ways that you've been encouraged in your faith community, maybe growing up, or any time over the years to practice kindness? Do you remember that? I'm going to send you back to your history.
Yeah.
We've talked at different times, and I know I've said this in different contexts, but for me, something I experienced that's really important that I also experience here is being inclusive. And the sense that whatever your age, race, religious background, one of the experiences I had was ability or disability, that you were accepted, and that was just a given. And it's certainly something that I would always want to encourage, but it was that was part of the DNA for me, and I think it is part of the DNA here, that unconditional acceptance, because we believe that's what God gives us. So we need to give it to each other.
And I'm going to follow up on you because I remember I grew up Catholic, and it was a lovely congregation. It really was. But I graduated from college, and I really it was no longer a good fit for me. And so I went to a church, and I knew nothing about denominations. And I went, and they talked about men, and I thought it meant men and women. And no, it meant men. And so I knew I was excluded. And so then I walked into a UCC church, and there's a woman pastor. And I thought, okay, now I get it. Now it really is inclusive. But yeah, that's a real part of the kindness I felt in that congregation, because it was inclusive in reality.
Yeah, I just think about a colleague who was in her 30s, 20s, 30s, who went to her sister's church and for the first time saw a woman processing on Christmas Eve and just wept the whole time and left her rather successful career to go to seminary because she knew that women could be pastors, but she had never seen it lived out. And I just think about that powerful story. I think for me, it was growing up in churches that were very mission oriented. Like I have very vivid memories of, as a young person, going to, for instance, in Arkansas, there is the Heifer Project International has a farm where they have, they both raise, but it's also to educate about the varied animals that they supply to the world. And I spent a life transforming week there as a young person. And it's one of the many reasons I'm such a fan of Heifer Project. But, it's just a part of why mission and outreach work is so important to me. And so being a part of different congregations growing up, but I think that's a common thread that, and that's a very Methodist thing from my background, but it's also it was a hallmark of my dad's ministry. And so I think it speaks to how he guided churches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on to the scripture that was really at the center of this chapter. The authors use the parable of the Good Samaritan as the model for what it means to practice kindness and compassion. For the first century listeners, this story answers the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus posed that question, and then he answered it in a completely unexpected way for his listeners. The first part of the story wasn't particularly surprising. Our neighbor is whoever is in need. That makes sense to all of us. It's the second part that would have shocked his listeners. Jesus made a Samaritan the hero of the story, the one who showed compassion and kindness. It may be hard for us to imagine what a great leap this would have been for his audience, because Samaritans were viewed with disdain and contempt by many in that day. They had different theological perspectives, and they worshiped in different ways. They were literally the other to those who were listening, and the other closest geographically to themselves. Bishop Will Willimon suggested that this is not so much a story of who we are to be a neighbor to, but rather about who is a neighbor to us, which I thought was an interesting distinction. So, how do you think Jesus tried to expand our understanding of who our neighbor is in this parable? And why do you think he did it?
I always remember doing some exegetical work, some research for preaching on this one time. And the idea that it's called the parable of the Good Samaritan is shocking in of itself, because no one who was hearing that story would have ever thought that there is anything called a Good Samaritan. And I just remember thinking, oh, okay, well, let's start there. It was just like at its very basic level that I think, again, lost in translation through the years. And I love Bishop Willimon's way of looking at Scripture. He always opens my eyes. I think Jesus is, both in this telling of the story and our interpretation and reading of the story, is trying to teach us both in being open to the care of others. For those of us, it's kind of like washing feet. For some of us, it's not difficult to serve and to wash the feet of others. For some of us, it's really difficult to be served. And so I think sometimes that's what Jesus is doing in this story, is trying to teach those of us who it's difficult to receive care that it's okay. And it's okay to be served by people who are different or who look different. I think about some of the meals that you and I've shared in Guatemala together, and I find it immensely uncomfortable to be served by people who I am there to serve and who I know are in abject poverty. But I also know that there is generosity in graciousness. And so to be gracious as you are served by people who want to show appreciation, that is a spiritual gift as well. And it's one I have to practice a lot.
Well, this is one of the many reasons that I love these conversations, because I always learn things and have to think about things in a new way. That's not a meaning I have immediately derived from the story of the Good Samaritan. What I was getting out of this book and the way that they discuss it is, the question is asked, who is my neighbor?
Yeah.
But really, another way, the double meaning that I was picking up is that the question being answered is, what does it mean to be a neighbor? And to that it's the Samaritan who is the one who is being a neighbor to the person in need. And so it's a different question. We say all the time, love God, love our neighbors as ourselves. To love our neighbor, to be a neighbor, what does that mean? And I appreciated the new insights from the book, as well as my colleague.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that I think is, so fascinating about that story, obviously it's one of my favorites, but I think is so rich about that story is the trust that occurs at the end of that story when the innkeeper enters the narrative. And the Samaritan, again, another layer of trust that the innkeeper believes that the Samaritan will reimburse the expenses, because the Samaritan says, just do whatever's necessary and I'll reimburse. And so again, the innkeeper has a whole nother, there's another neighbor aspect there that, while the authors don't talk about that, again, part of the just research I've done on this, it's just such a rich story. And it's kind of like the prodigal child. I always find myself in a different part of the story every time it comes up. And I love it. Yeah.
Because that innkeeper had to trust somebody who was the other to him too.
Right.
And that's a whole lot of it
About money.
about money, which is a
Which we
real
really,
challenge.
yeah, exactly.
And I found it interesting because when they were asking Jesus, who is my neighbor, I almost get this sense that they're looking for the lowest definition of that, the easiest definition. And Jesus is going, it's not that, I'm not going to make it easy for you. I really want you to stretch your imagination to who your neighbor really is and who's going to be a neighbor to you. Because I think sometimes we want the easy way out, and Jesus does not allow for that in this story, in my book. Jesus is always stretching us, I think.
Again, the radical part of Jesus is to push us both, I think, individually and corporately.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to be a little more specific. There's many different definitions of radical that could apply to Jesus, but I think what 21st Christians have to hear, what I need to keep telling myself, is that part of the radical nature is the counterculture. That I'm teaching you something which is not just ordinary human ways of living and interacting. I'm trying to tell you something different about how to live together. And I think, particularly in the United States, where Christianity has been predominant, and that's going to change, it is changing, but there's been this too easy assumption that doing whatever's being a good American, whatever that means, is the same as being a good Christian. And Jesus keeps calling us back to, there's something else here. And we need to be open to hear when our faith calls us to go up against those ordinary ways of living.
So let me ask you the next question. So Jesus were telling the story today. Who would the good person be? I mean, I think there's a lot of options
Right,
there.
exactly.
But what would shock everyone here? Who would that person be?
Yeah, I mean, I was on a panel in our community last night, and we were talking. One of the things that we were talking about is the issue around transgender persons and particularly young people in our community, because our school board does not have a consistent policy, particularly around bathroom use on all of our campuses. And so I think, so I'm thinking, Deb, about your question about how would that fit into that narrative about what does it look like, and what does it mean to say a transgender person as my neighbor, or an Immokalee person, a resident of Immokalee, going back to what I was saying earlier, to help me, because I'm always prepared to help residents of Immokalee, but to turn and receive that care.
Yeah.
One of the things that comes to my mind is if you think of it as who's the person who's doing the good thing here that you wouldn't expect to be doing the good thing here. One of the groups I think in much of the world, and certainly much of our country, would be Muslims.
Yeah, I was just thinking
That they are still pretty much maligned by far too many people, and they're not the ones that you would expect. And yet, I think it was after the Tree of Life synagogue massacre. If not, it was another one where it was the Muslim community that came and stood to
Around.
keep
It was Tree of Life.
the people who were inside worshiping safe. So it happens, but that's one I would think.
No, I think you answered that question so much better, because you're exactly right. It's about anticipating those who would not be good.
We would not expect
We would not expect
to
good.
function
Excuse me.
in that
Yeah.
role. And so the answer might be different for all of us.
Yeah.
Who would surprise us the most by being a good Samaritan? And I guess I'm going to leave that one for our audience to answer. Who would that be for you?
Well, and I'll give you one other that comes to my mind. I mentioned the question of immigration because of welcoming the stranger. I think there's a great stereotype that's been promulgated about undocumented immigrants, that they must be bad people, and that they would not be the people you would expect to be helping out others or whatever. It's a stereotype. But as I try to think about who do we castigate and not expect good to come from?
And it's always about stereotype for this.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's a differentiation there about immigrant versus undocumented worker. I think that's like a sub level, and I think that's an even more demonized group of people.
Like caste systems?
Oh yeah, touche. I was in I'm just curious. Okay, never mind.
Okay, I'm going to move on because we have two more points to
Yes,
get
ma'am.
through, and we could talk forever. So the second focus of this chapter is on showing love for the stranger. So when we look at the scriptures, we see some surprising statements, I think. Peter Marty, the publisher of the Christian Century, wrote, "On this matter of the stranger, we should learn from the ancient Jews. Only once does the Hebrew Bible contain the command to love the neighbor, which is in Leviticus 19:18. But more than 35 times, though these same scriptures command one to love the stranger. So why is there an emphasis on the stranger? Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, our neighbor is one we love because he or she is like ourselves. The stranger is the one we are taught to love precisely because he or she is not like ourselves." So I really think that Rabbi Sachs is confirming and reaffirming what Jesus seemed to be saying. It is easy to love people who are like us. The challenge comes with people we don't identify with. So, how can we grow in learning to connect with those we see as strangers?
So is it South Pacific? You have to be taught
Oh,
to
yeah.
hate? I'm really missing live theater, by the way. So, but no, I
Right.
mean, like, and I think, okay, so it's the day of inauguration. And I think there are those who are tempted to say it's the day where there's a group of winners and there's a group of losers. But really, it's a day about our country. And so whether you voted for President Biden and Vice President Harris or for someone else, it's really about finding the commonality. I mean, to get really relevant today, I mean, to fast forward to about that. And so do you choose to see those that you didn't vote for as a stranger, or do you choose to try to find common ground? I mean, I think there's a lot of people in Washington, D.C. tonight asking themselves, I hope there are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. asking themselves that question tonight.
Well, and certainly, I don't think it's a partisan statement to say that the inaugural address challenged all of us to work together and to find that common ground and to find ways of working together for the common good. I think it's really complicated because part of what we do is to unconsciously perhaps, but segregate ourselves. We've talked before about where we live, who we interact with. Sometimes for me to learn compassion and love the stranger who thinks really differently than I do, I have to come in contact with that person. And I don't always, and sometimes I don't want to. So it's a challenge. I actually think it's an opportunity for the church, because the church can be a place where we bring people together who have different experiences, different beliefs, and provide a safe space for conversation. But we live two segregated lives, TOO, so that I think it makes it harder to interact in a way that will allow us to get to know and show kindness and compassion for the stranger.
Okay. Was there any new learning you had from that knowledge about welcoming the stranger? Was there anything that was new for you? I personally was surprised by, the neighbor. What was it that only once in the Hebrew Bible
Yeah.
was there a command to love the neighbor, but 35 times to welcome the stranger? And I was just really intrigued and wondered about that. And so for me, I think in that era, what I learned is that if you didn't welcome the stranger, I mean, your neighbor you were going to welcome anyway, but a stranger, if you didn't welcome a stranger, that person could die because it, there weren't that many way stations along the way. And so you might be a stranger at one point, and so it was reciprocal kind of kindness to do that. And so it made me wonder about how that would apply still today.
It reminded me, while they don't speak to it, but I too was struck by that. That was not something I knew. But it also reminded me about how the greatest sin in the desert and the greatest sin of First Testament time was the lack of hospitality. For exactly what you pointed out, that is about life and death. And so, the people often want to attribute the sin of Leviticus about homosexuality. The sin of the town in Leviticus is around hospitality. It's about welcoming the stranger. That was the sin of Sodom, the town of Sodom, was they didn't welcome the stranger. And so it just reminds me about our call as a church, as a community, as an individual is how do we, we're in the season of remembering incarnation, God made real to us. So how do we live that out?
Yeah.
And it's that challenge, right?
It
I
is.
mean, if it were easy, we wouldn't talk about it.
Yeah. What do you think gets in the way of welcoming the stranger, either in our personal lives or in the church or in our communities? Because I think it's very difficult to welcome the stranger in these days in different ways and for different
Yeah.
reasons than then, but I think it's just as much of an issue.
I mean, I think it's so much around fear.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually what you were just talking about, Sharon, of it's that separation. So which we don't know and we are separated from, we're afraid of. And I think that's a naturally human, that's not an indictment, that's a human instinct. And so then when we do not understand and do not know what's going on with or understand someone's motives or why someone functions a certain way or just have commonality, then it's just so easy to be afraid.
So how do you get past the fear?
Oh, let me.
I'm not
Answer
sure how to
the
get over the
first
fear.
question.
But what I was thinking about is the specific question of, for example, in church. And I think one of the things is you really have to be intentional or it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And again, it's not an indictment, it's human nature. But there are a whole lot of people who, when they come to church on Sunday morning and when we get back in person, they want to catch up with their friends. They want to interact with the people they know and love and haven't seen since the week before or maybe last season
Or 10 months before.
months before. But there may be 5 people in the congregation at that moment who've never been here before, who are strangers. And unless somebody is intentional about looking out for them, about introducing themselves, then we're not going to be welcoming them because we didn't notice them because it's so good to see you. I want to talk to you. And it's not unkindness. It's just our lives are complex, but I do think it's really important to be intentional about identifying the newcomers and people who may be like us and may not be like us, and we need to welcome. It's not welcoming if I say, "Oh, that's my pew."
Right.
You're sitting in my pew.
So, this is the natural segue because we're actually running out of time. The last part of the chapter goes from welcoming the stranger to practicing hospitality, which is kind of what you just talked about. I know we want this place to be a place of radical inclusivity, and we work to make that real. I think we really try hard. The authors asserted that, like the sitcom Cheers, we all long for a place where everybody knows our name and where we can be accepted and loved for who we are, which is exactly what you were talking about. They used an example of a sign in the narthex of a Lutheran church that read, "We welcome diversity of race, culture, spirituality, gender, identity, ability, and orientation. We seek to provide a safe and inclusive place for all. We reject intolerance and any form of degradation, hurt, or abuse. We commit in words and actions to uphold the rights of all to feel safe, valued, and respected. Within this space, love, peace, and understanding unify us." So I've really been thinking a lot about it. 10 months of being apart
Oh,
makes us really think about these things because when we come back together, I think we've thought a lot about what we're really good at and what we could improve. And so, how do you think we could grow in becoming even more inclusive personally and in this faith community?
so this is like a really practical thing that I was actually thinking about. I mentioned last night, or that I was last night on this community panel, and I was struck by, in the culture where we've been at home and distanced so much, that things have become increasingly casual. And so to be on a panel in the community, I would normally be in a suit and tie and all this. And I was in a shirt similar to this. I was not in a jacket because I was on a Zoom call for this panel. And I just remember thinking, in some ways, it probably made me more approachable in this particular audience. And I thought to myself, how do we as a church become more approachable to people who don't necessarily want to wear a suit and tie on Sunday mornings, or even a button-up shirt and slacks, because they may not have wanted to before the pandemic, but they probably really don't want to now, because it will be very interesting to see what social norms have adjusted, because I've watched myself in those, and it's different.
And I started thinking about the fact that when we come back, we won't be doing it the way we did it before. Like, we came, we hugged each other, and we shook hands. And, I don't know about you, but there's because we're all in masks, there's a little suspicion about people now. And that does not help with hospitality in my mind, because in my mind, I'm thinking, do you have your mask on? Like, can I approach you? So I think we've got to learn all new ways of being really intentional about welcoming people with our eyes, and because it's going to be different.
Yeah.
That is a very good point, and I've thought a lot about the things that we used to do that we won't be able to do for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
Does anybody else worry about names?
What do you mean?
Well, just like, I'm a visual person. Like, if I see Sharon and the face, I'm much better at remembering. I'm not good at names on a piece of paper. And so I'm just confessing, this is really my group therapy time, that, after not seeing people for 11 months, I just worry about that. And so I also wonder if this is also a time of great equalization.
In what way?
That if someone's new, they're not an outsider. That they're not going to be the person that's not called by name, because I worry if I'm going to call anyone by name. I will, I promise. But it's just, I don't know. Like, those are some of the anxieties I have. I'm just being really honest about, am I going to know anyone by their name?
Well, and maybe everyone will be a stranger.
Right. I do. I kind of wonder if it's like waking up after a stroke and having that part of my brain like damaged. I really have wondered about that's a fear. I've literally had nightmares about that. I really have.
Interesting.
And here's a different change that I think we could be dealing with, which, like masks and distancing, complicates how we relate and care for each other, how we show that compassion. We've had this conversation, but I think there are many people who have become so appreciative of our virtual service that even when we are back in person, will many times choose to worship from home.
Yeah.
Whether it's because they live in Estero and it's more than an hour to get here, or because they're vulnerable for health reasons, or any number of possibilities. I just think there are some people who maybe they watch live stream occasionally, but it wasn't a part of their normal life, who now find that very rich and meaningful and will not immediately come back. And I can name some names in my head. So then the challenge of, how do we make those connections? Mm-hmm. How do we keep the relationship strong when we're not interacting in person even after we can.
You know, and it's been interesting to me because I've been teaching some classes, as you have, during this, and I started getting people in classes from
Yeah.
all over the country. And so they will never be here in person. These are not our snowbirds. These are people who live other places who found us online.
Yeah.
And so it challenges me to imagine what does it look like to welcome the stranger, to practice hospitality virtually. Because, you know, as we've said, when we do classes going forward, once we can finally meet in person, we're still going to be doing, you know, having people join us
Right.
in classes virtually.
Well, I mean, I think we've talked about it, and I've been asked a few times, but like, what does Clergy Roundtable look like when we can gather in person? And, you know, I envision a format where people are here with us, but it's also virtual so that it's interactive in the room. Perhaps we invite people to ask questions here, but that we also have a way that people submit questions, you know, online as well. Or I don't know. I mean, we're just kind of thinking out loud. But you know, we have the sign of hope is that we are starting to have questions about what does it look like when we're back in person. But it's also it will be different. And that's exciting at some level. It's a little discouraging because, you know, I think for myself, I want to just wave a magic wand and it just be like it was before. And we know that's not reality. But it's also where those opportunities, like you say, how do we build those relationships in new and different ways? And what does that look like?
Yeah. So, this was our conversation on kindness and compassion. And after watching the inauguration today, I think there's a real call to kindness and compassion in our culture. And this book is really, really good for us. And so next week we're going to do chapter 4. And I think it's even more important, which is walking humbly with
I was
our
going to
God.
say humility.
Humility has got to be at the heart of all of this moving forward in our faith communities, in our nation. And so, what I'd really like to do is leave you with the words from Episcopal Bishop Michael Curry, who spoke these words in the wedding sermon for Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. He said, "When love is the way, poverty will become history. When love is the way, the earth will be a sanctuary. When love is the way, we will lay our swords and shields down by the riverside to study war no more. When love is the way, there's plenty of room for all God's children." Have a great week and good night.